Welcome to March for Science, New York City's Economic Policy Panel, the fifth panel in our STEM the Vote series, where together we learn about different voting issues. Before we get into it with our moderator and panelists, I want to give a brief introduction to March for Science NYC and our sponsor, Science Rising. So March for Science New York City is a nonpartisan nonprofit platform formed by the greater scientific community. We stand for three principles. The first one being the open access of scientific information to the general public, the use of science for the common good and in the preservation of an informed democracy, and the protection of human and environmental rights. Throughout the year, we hold educational events connecting the public to activists, scientists, and public officials to promote direct action to support science policy. In 2020, we believe that in addition to protests and petitions, the most effective action is to vote. Participating in local elections to presidential elections, casting our ballots is how all of us can each affect policy. So during this digital age with information abound, navigating the political process can be a daunting task. We hope to put science in the hands of voters, and this STEM the Vote initiative seeks to provide voters with up-to-date peer-reviewed knowledge on key voting issues to bridge the gap between science and activism. We want to acknowledge Science Rising and the Union of Concerned Scientists for sponsoring this initiative. We encourage everyone to take the Science Rising Challenge, which consists of 3 key actions. First, make sure you're registered to vote. Second, make a plan to vote either by mail or in person during the early voting period or on election day, November 3rd. And 3, pick a civics activity to involve yourself in, like engaging with friends and family members to boost voter turnout or to reach out to your political candidates in your districts. For more information for Science Rising, you can visit their website at sciencerising.org. And so now I get to introduce our awesome panelists and moderator. So today we're joined by Shom and Elsy. Shom is a social scientist, writer, and fellow at Data for Progress. He studies why labor coercion exists and how economic democracy might lead to a more free and democratic society. He's also working on a book titled From the Chain Gang to the Picket Line, Race, Class, and the Origins of the Early Carceral State that explores this theme in the context of prison and policing in the United States. Elsy is a labor organizer born in Beirut, Lebanon. Her background is in chemistry. She spent 8 years as a chemistry and science middle school and high school teacher. Before coming to New York to start her PhD in chemistry at New York University, where now she develops probes for metals and pH. Starting when she joined the Teachers Union, Elsy has been organizing in unions for over a decade, and she's now a force in the Graduate Student Organizing Committee, where she represents fellow grad students and voices concerns of the international student body at NYU. So thank you both for Shom and Elsy for being with us today. And a quick housekeeping note, we have the chat disabled, so if you have questions, please drop them in the Q&A section, and we'll try our best to get them to the panelists throughout the time. And now I will hand it off to our communications co-director, Jairo, to moderate.
Thanks, Tiara. Happy to be here, and I just wanted to start off with asking a quick question for Shom, which is, economically speaking, how did we get here and where we are right now? Not just with Corona, but in terms of our the state of our economy, really. I know that's a bit of a big question to start off.
There are probably 30 answers, and they're all right. But I'll highlight a few that I find particularly persuasive. And I'm happy to talk about others that might be out there as well. So I basically would first like to highlight just a big trend that I think is striking to me. So over much of the course of where we have like really good or decent economic data where we're able to measure output per worker, which is a measure of productivity, and wages. So for the first half of the 20th century, you see a strong linear correlation between output per worker or productivity and wages, which is, if you're in thinking about kind of what standard economic theory would tell you, like that's a good sign that those things should be correlated and be moving together. But what you see essentially in the 80s is a decoupling of that relationship. So you see output per worker going up, and to the point where, the average worker today is more productive than they have ever been, but their wages have completely stagnated. So their real wage is essentially the same as what they would have had, at least the average worker. So to me, that says that there's been kind of a structural transformation in the economy since the 80s, right around the time when Reagan got into office, and you can imagine what a lot of those policies might have been. But there's also kind of another dimension of it, in that the way in which inequality has happened. So if you look at wealth inequality today, it's at its all-time high, in part because there's been this decoupling. But it's also, if you think about economic inequality and trends in it, there's a staggering racial wealth gap. So according to a recent study by Raj Chetty, who's an economist at Harvard, and a bunch of his co-authors, they've been basically gathering tax data for a while to understand social mobility or economic mobility in the US. And they have a really striking finding, which is that a Black male from a relatively wealthy family has a lower chance of staying in the top of the income or the wealth distribution than a poor white male, or a white male who comes from a poor family. So that already tells you that the way in which inequality has manifested itself, so it's not only high, but it's also incredibly racialized, in that even, African Americans or Black people who are born into some amount of wealth have a harder time hanging on to that. So wealth is precarious in racialized ways. And on the other hand, just to think about other macro level trends that are much more closely related to workers, is that union density is at an all-time low. So if you think, or private sector union density. So it used to be, right after World War II in the 50s, around actually 50% of private sector workers were covered under some collective bargaining agreement. Today, that's around 9 or 10%. So union density has gone down. So the institutions that facilitate worker power are more or less dwindling. There's a lot of other labor market conditions that just make work harder today. So this concept of monopsony, which is when there's only one big employer in town, and so all workers have to essentially work at one employer, which gives the employer a lot of bargaining power over wages. This union density explanation is also a big factor, and just the rise in other, state laws such as right to work. And then behind all of that context, so that's pretty much, giving you kind of the economic picture, but there's a big kind of political or political economy story as well. And so Alex Hurl-Fernandez, who's a political scientist at Columbia University, has this great book that just came out, State Capture, in which he talks about a lot of the reasons why the specific policies that started happening in the 80s and through the 90s and 2000s that contributed to this racialized wealth inequality and loss of worker power, is essentially because business got really smart about being politically organized. They stopped kind of, at some sense they had a lot of money to throw around at politics, but they threw it around in really strategically interesting ways by focusing on local and state level politics rather than national level politics. So if you think about, for instance, policies like right to work, which hurt the formation of unions, those are all state level policies that have by and large been passed by this big organization called ALEC, which is funded by the Koch brothers. And so, Alex Hurdle Fernandez goes into a lot of detail. I would encourage you to read that book. But those are, to me, kind of the big economic trends of, how to think about where we got here, and also to give you a sense of, the politics of how we got here as well.
Sorry, just that I can put it in the chat. What was the name of that book?
State Capture.
Great. So just to go back on something that you said, you were talking about how at the moment there is the biggest gap in wealth inequality that we've basically seen in history. At the same time, we've seen that there's been about 33% drop in the annualized GDP as of just a couple of days ago. How would you say that compares to previous downturns in the economy, like the Great Recession, the Depression, and even, I guess, even more relevant, the 1918 influenza pandemic?
So I think in some ways, like I think there's some reasons to be optimistic about, the ability to weather that. I think, understandings, what I think you're seeing now is that, there are reasons, even though this is kind of at the same level of, like a Great Depression, or, as you mentioned, kind of the 1918 influenza pandemic, we have seen a lot of organizing around making sure, unemployment stabilizers are there. Obviously, that hasn't, lasted as long as we'd like it to. And, that's currently up for debate in Congress. We don't really know the future of that program. So there's some, I think, optimism that, that workers or labor are in a position to, bargain for these things. And according to kind of like recent polling, a majority of Americans are in favor of a lot of these. Not really solutions, but really band-aids on the problem. The problem is, a pandemic, and that's kind of, we'll have to wait for a vaccine that works. But a symptom of that has been this economic collapse. So there's optimism, I think. But I'd also say there's a lot of different than what was happening back then. And I like to think about, I think there's a parallel between the Great Depression and the New Deal and kind of the moment that we're in today. And I think the reason, if you were to be pessimistic, is the way in which identity issues have polarized America in ways that we didn't really quite have when, Congress and the president were trying to, pass a New Deal, in which it was essentially understood among all parties that African Americans would be written out of the New Deal, and that's what made it tenable to everyone else. So that was an easy way to help make sure that this got passed. I think we're in a very different situation today in which, that would no longer be tenable to write out in, a huge plurality of Americans from the types of economic policies that would be needed. But that also means it's harder to get something passed.
Thanks. So touching on some of the things that Shom said, Elsy, I know that you have a lot of experience with unions and unionizing. And as Shom mentioned, we've seen a decrease in unions as of late. Have unions really developed any new strategies to overcome that? And for those who are unfamiliar, what are the benefits of a union in the first place?
Yeah, hello. So yes, unions have been declining for a while. Basically, the last president who was pro-union was Lyndon Johnson, I guess. This is what I read recently. So it's been quite a while since we've seen legislators and politicians supporting unions. have unions become or found a solution? Because if we look at the results now, the unions are still in decline. I would say not really, but there are reasons to be optimistic about this. What unions need to do is they need to be more creative. They need to diversify their terms, and one example that we can look at is the Occupy movement. That came from really like the people that organized it had such big imagination, and everybody was affected by it. Millions of people. It spread across the world. Everybody knows about the 1% now. It's no strange topic. And people are becoming more aware of the importance of solidarity. So this can be seen through the Black Lives Matter movement recently. I'm not comparing that to unions, but the importance of solidarity is important. So I think that if anything needs to be done is for unions to play on this.
Gotcha. So going off of that, just once again, for those who may not be aware, what are the benefits of being part of a union? Because maybe that's something that isn't spoken about enough nowadays with, as you said, there aren't really politicians or presidents who are in favor of unionizing. What's a reason that one who isn't in a union should consider joining one, if that's an option available to them?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So many things that people take for granted nowadays are the result of organized labor and unions. You can think of weekends, you can think of 8-hour shifts, you can think of Social Security, of the abolition of child labor, and many other things. So what organized labor or what labor union is, it's an organization of workers that is formed for the purpose of advancing the workers' interest. That is to improve their economic status, we're talking about wages, I'm talking about benefits, and the working conditions in matters of safety, and this is done through collective bargaining. And for those who don't know what collective bargaining is, it's a process it's a process of negotiations between the employer, which is the company management or university management, and the employee representatives, that is the labor union. And they spent several sessions negotiating the base pay, the overtime pay, the work hours, the shift length, the holidays, the sick leaves, family leave, vacation, retirement, healthcare, and what else. So all these benefits, they are secured through collective bargaining, through unions usually. And it propagates. Usually some people that are not in unions get these benefits or part of them. And in most countries, the union formation process is regulated by the government, by something like in the US, there's the NLRB, that is the National Labor Relations Board. And so to form a union, for those who don't have a union, what needs to be done is for the workers need to agree, they collect signature, and they decide to form a union. So among the benefits, other than what I mentioned before, there's a gap between, in certain jobs, between workers that are unionized and workers that are not unionized. For example, I can mention these numbers, and you can find them on the Bureau of Labor Statistics of the US Department of Labor. So there's the workers that are not unionized, they have a median weekly earnings that is 80% that of unionized workers. So if workers need to advance their agenda to better their conditions, they need to unionize. That's what I have to say about it.
So on that note, we can say that the purpose of the union is to put the power back into the workers' hands, which in that case, my follow-up question to that, which would be, Elsy, I'll let you answer, and then I'd like to hear what Shom has to say about it as well. Would you say that at this point there are economic policies who their sole purpose is really to, I guess it's not really a balancing act, but in terms of the unions trying to prevent unions from getting too much power into the workers' hands? Are there any such economic policies that you think are working against unions right now? And how is that contributing to today's economic and political climate?
I would say that there are certainly laws preventing that. It's laws and it's like stigmatization of union members or union leaders that started after or during the Cold War, where leaders of unions were branded as communist and they were purged basically from the unions, and the laws that were passed were not pro-union. So oftentimes now, whenever there's an arbitration, it goes in favor of the employer, especially when the union is weak. And with the decline of the unions, I think Shom mentioned the numbers before, there's like 10.7% of workers that are unionized now. That is even less if you look at the private sector, that is 6%. 6 point something percent, and 33% in the public sector, and 6% in the private sector. So yes, I would say that legislations have not helped the unions, and also the employers have not been encouraging, or sometimes they advise their employees not to unionize because it is costly for them. So all these have contributed in the decline.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, to jump off of that, I think if you're thinking about specific laws, I think, laws like, there are two types of laws. So one are laws that prevent unionization in the first place, and then there are laws that prevent unions from exerting power. So if you think about, what is, on the first part, the types of laws that prevent unions are usually what are kind of known as right-to-work laws. And so what those laws are, essentially, it sounds like a very reasonable thing at first. It's, if you want to form a union, not everybody has to participate in that union. But then if you think about it and kind of the logic, what's kind of very, politically smart by people who've been advocating for these laws is that the union members, despite being able to opt out of the union, still get the benefits of unionization. So if you think of, a classic collective action problem where everybody benefits in some shared resource, but nobody wants to pay the cost, that's going to hinder the formation of union in the first place, because why would I join this union if somebody else can free ride off of it? So part of the purpose of a union is to essentially, coordinate amongst all of the employees around an organization that can provide, collective goods that are greater than, whatever the union dues that they would be paying for. So that's the first type of law. The second type of law are those that prevent, unions from using their power. And this is particularly in the public sector, in that a lot of states have laws where you're essentially not allowed to go on strike if you're in union. If you think about what's the, largest source of power for unions, that they can withhold their labor. And that, the right to strike among private sector unions is supposed to be, a universal right. And if you look at a lot of, human rights declarations around the world, the right to strike is actually something that's enshrined in a lot of, human rights documents. But in the United States, for public sector employees, it's a very different story. And so I think those are two kind of laws on paper that make it very hard for unions to organize, either in the private sector or in the public sector. I would also say there's something, bigger around, and I think what Elsy hinted at also is that, just sentiment towards unions has really gone south. So the American public, if you look at any polling, they don't really support unions as strongly as a lot of other institutions. And even among, if you look at some surveys about where people want to work, whether there's a union isn't actually a huge factor anymore, at least. And so I think part of it is people have lost the sense of like, what is that benefit that unions have given the average worker? So part of it is, there are lots of elites out there telling them that, there's nothing in it for you. And part of it is kind of this feedback loop where if you have weaker and weaker unions, there's fewer and fewer people left to organize workers, less infrastructure. So that's also kind of another dimension of, where we're at today with regard to unions.
I can jump in here and second what you said, especially the first part, because I'm an organizer at NYU, and it's a private university, and there are like so many things that keep us from organize or discourage students from joining the union. One thing is what Shom mentioned, that employees and I'm referring to graduate student workers, people that teach as employees here, they are not required to join the union, but they do benefit from everything the union has gained through their contract with NYU. So that's one thing. And the other thing is sometimes like NYU or any private employer can decide which category of workers can unionize and which category cannot. I am in the science, and if I am not actually teaching, if I'm only a research assistant, I am not allowed to unionize. So I do a research, I am a graduate student worker, but I personally cannot unionize. But if I was in the humanities and other field outside of STEM, workers are allowed to unionize. I must mention that STEM workers have so much power. They do the actual research. The outcome of their research is sold. There's benefit from that, but they are not allowed to unionize. So yeah, that's something that's also burdening the unions and weakening it.
Gotcha. And on that note, we actually have a question from Latoya Anderson. So Elsy, she's part of a union and works for the city and has heard a lot of misinformation about their purpose. What are some of the biggest myths about unions that you'd like to dispel?
That unions are there to take your money and they don't offer anything in return. That's the first thing that we are confronting when I go and talk to someone. I'm like, hey, would you join the union? You will have to pay 1% or 1.5% of your monthly income, or your your income, your salary as union dues. And they'd be like, oh, but I can't benefit from all this without paying these dues. Why would I? But the union guarantees an increase, for example, at NYU of 2.25% every year. So you're still getting the increase, the benefit. It's not like you're only losing the money. Also, another myth is, what is the union going to do for you? If there is a problem in the workplace and it's only one individual, it is so hard to sue a big corporation or a big employer. The union is there to do that for you. You only have to reach out to your union representative, and the union has the contacts. They have the lawyers. They will do the job, especially if the union is strong. The union is strong when it has more members and when the members are paying their dues.
Thank you, Latoya. I hope that answers your question. Shom, you mentioned a few things about labor laws and such, and something that has been a very touchy subject to a lot of people in the pre-COVID economic discussion, and I'm sure it'll continue to be worse in the post-COVID economic discussion, but the Green New Deal. It's been considered to be part of labor laws as well as an overall economic and political kind of a juggernaut in terms of all of the different things that it affects. I know you mentioned the New Deal earlier. How do you think the Green New Deal would fit in a post-COVID economic recovery scenario? Do you think it has a place? How should it be retooled, if anything?
Sure. So let me maybe break that into 3 parts. So the first part is, if you, believe in the science around climate change, then, aggressive climate policy is essentially only option at this point. So if you don't believe in that premise, talking about green anything is not really, worth it. So you have to kind of believe in that premise. Number 2, there's this question of what is a Green New Deal. So I mean, there are lots of different variations on it. I think the broadest theme from, what I understand, those who advocate for it are, is essentially it's an aggressive climate policy that centers, issues of inequality and economic justice and racial justice. So it's climate policy plus economic justice and racial justice. And so that's how I'd broadly define what a Green New Deal looks like, or, a vision. And on the third part, so what is the purpose of linking, the economic justice and the racial justice components? There are 2 reasons why you might want to do that. So the first type of reason is that, the impacts of climate change are disproportionately felt on, communities of color and poor communities. That's kind of pretty well established. So if that is the case, if there's disproportionate burden on these groups, then, any solution should recognize that disproportionate burden. So that's one justification for, a Green New Deal as combining economic and racial justice components to it. And then there's how do you build support for it and make sure, it lasts. And there's this concept in political science known as policy feedback, where the types of policies and the way in which you design it can either help or hinder its long-term public support for it. So an example that people have is in that literature is, Social Security. Prior to Social Security happening, it was framed around protecting, vulnerable senior populations, and there are a lot of good reasons to do that, judging the circumstances in that time period, where poverty among the elderly and senior community is incredibly high. So Social Security, was designed to address a specific economic justice issue, but it also created a huge constituency of new voters who were mobilized afterwards. So if you think about, who are some of the most, the groups that participate in politics the most, it's the elderly. And so part of that, the research shows, is that because Social Security generates this system that people, want to maintain and make sure that there's a longevity to it. And I think you can also make a similar argument for, why the Green New Deal needs to have these economic and racial justice components to it, especially on the economic side, is that if you think about the transition from, coal or, gas to electric and clean energy technologies, that's going to, the bad news is that's going to require, eliminating certain industries, which means that there are jobs on the line. But that's where kind of the economic justice part comes in, is that even though your job will be changed, that one, there will be a job guarantee, so you won't be unemployed. And then 2, there are other policies like healthcare that are tied into some conceptualizations of the Green New Deal, and those are meant to be, ways in which that transition from costly, dirty energy sectors can be made more smooth into clean energy sectors. So those are, I would say, the way on which I tend to think about, what is a Green New Deal and how does it fit into these broader issues of economic inequality and racial justice?
That sounds like, that transition sounds like a job for unions. Elsy, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
No, actually, Shom touched on everything I wanted to say about that, I guess.
So I guess, Elsy, I then have a question for you in terms of, I guess, a post-COVID world in terms of schools reopening in September. We've already seen in Georgia things reopened yesterday to not so great effect. But in terms of how NYU has started planning its reopening, has the graduate student unions or any of the other student unions really been involved with that? How have they communicated with you? Has your input been taken well?
Yeah, the union has been active, very active since day one. The union has been in contact with professors, with undergraduate students, and they formed what is the COVID Coalition. And they've been working on a bunch of different ways to help people that were affected by COVID. Also, the union was very active recently in matters of involving international students being deprived of their visas. And there was like this whole thing about deporting students that are already in the US, etc. So the union was very quick to issue statements and to push NYU to respond to that. And in terms of reopening, one of the things that not only the union at NYU, but every union is concerned with is the safety of the workplace. So the union is in touch with everybody that already returned and with people that are returning. So they're pushing to delay the reopening and in-person teaching, or to make sure that in case there is any reopening, the ventilation is adequate, that personal protective equipment is provided. The health and safety of the professors is also a major issue, and the professors are not unionized. But the union is also taking this into account. And right now, GSOC, like the union at NYU, is involved or is actively bargaining, and our contract expires at the end of this month, and we're looking forward to a better contract with NYU. And all these things involving emergency funds in case anything like this happens again, and the safety of the workers should be included in is included in the contract. Hopefully it passes.
So something that's been mentioned a few times is, on top of returning to schools, is the talk of labor and how unions have been basically involved in every step of the process. So I wanted to ask mostly about how you feel about what's going on with teachers returning. How do you feel the response has been, especially when it comes, there's been a lot of talk about how this would affect the economy if schools were not to properly reopen due to COVID, then parents wouldn't be able to go back to work. But on both sides, what do you think is actually the best course of action? Should we be going with what Cuomo is describing as the hybrid system? Should we be fully reopening? Should we continue to stay fully online? I know it's a hard line to draw, but I'd just like to know your thoughts on what's happening, especially since Elsy, you have experience with unions, and Shom, obviously the economic side.
Yeah, I can answer about unions. We have to distinguish students in universities and colleges and students in school. For students that go to universities, I think an online system should be fine, and is the safest way. Is the safest ways to go. The number of students per class is huge. We're talking hundreds of people gathering in one room. That's like if they are to reopen fully. So I'm certainly opposed to that, and most of my, if not all, my folks in the union are opposed to a full reopening. But when we talk about younger students, I see the concern of parents. I understand that, but there's also the safety of teachers. We cannot send the teachers back to die, pretty much. So, and I cannot see a solution to this. A hybrid solution, a hybrid way may be the solution. There definitely must be very few students per class. They should be socially distanced. There should be more teachers. This is all I can say about schools. I understand it's a real tragedy, because teaching kids online is very different, and one cannot ask a 7-year-old to sit there like in front of a computer all day and learn something. Yeah, that goes beyond union. The union, I think, is concerned with the safety of the teachers.
Shom, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I don't have a ton more really to add on. I think the only thing I would say is, like, in terms of, reopening the economy at this point, and the economy, being not just business, but also just, basic daily life the reality is that, there's still a pandemic and we don't have a vaccine. And so I think part of it is like, we need to come, accept reality, that this is how the world is. And it's like, until we kind of solve that core issue, everything else is essentially, a bandage over the problem. The second thing I would also say, like, specifically on the education issues, I think it also exposes, this moment, I think, has exposed a lot of inequalities. It's exposed, injustices in healthcare, where if you lose, it's very apparent now that if you lose your job, as many people have, you lose your healthcare too, and that's huge. And I think here, what we're also in the realm of education, where I think we're learning, is that we've massively underfunded schools to the point where they're not able to, adapt in these ways. Like, if you think about children in low-income school districts, many of them maybe don't have, fast internet, don't have computers at home. And so we haven't really even made those basic foundational investments in education to even, do a lot of the things that we need to do. So I think that's just the only thing I'd add.
So on that note about sorry, I totally just blanked on the word, investments, in terms of how that economic impact is related to teachers and everything. Something that is also highly skewed is teachers in poor communities. And I know, Shom, you spoke about wealth inequality and how disproportionate it is, especially in communities of color. But just to kind of tie the two together, Ravi actually had a question about banks, in terms of, are banks that are divesting from fossil fuels adapting to also divest from other sectors that negatively impact communities of color, like the defense industry or ICE? Just if you have any words of advice in terms of finding a new bank that actually makes their environmental justice lens clear, both in terms of how they're moving away from fossil fuels, but also how they plan on helping more underprivileged communities, because they do go hand in hand.
So I have to say I'm not, an expert on, banking and finance, but, the things, I think that question, perhaps even my own ignorance, is showing that, like, I don't think we really know just where investments or, money is going in the first place and what organization. So I think even just, as scientists or, people who work with data, just, shedding some light on those issues, like what is our system of money? Where is it going? When we put our money into, Bank of America, where does that get lent to? Who else, is profiting from that? Those are a lot of kind of basic, just descriptive facts that we don't know yet. Or at least I haven't seen like publicized. So I think it seems like step one is like diagnose the problem, understand what is the landscape. And then I think, there are solutions out there that provide alternative forms of finance, credit unions. There's other examples I'm happy to give as well. But those have not really taken off in the same way, major banks have as well.
Elsie, did you have anything you'd like to add to that?
I wanted to mention credit unions, but Shom already mentioned them.
Gotcha. So on that note, we've talked a lot about how we want the economy to interact with different communities and how COVID is affecting things. We've touched a little bit on fossil fuels right now in terms of how banks are pledging to divest from them. But one important thing that I'd like to ask both of you is, why should STEM students or STEM workers care about economic policy? I know we've seen, we're 95 days away from the election at this point, but the shift has gone from the number one concern being the economy to what are we doing about COVID? And that seems like a big intersection between science and economic policy. And I would just like to hear your thoughts about that, as well as I'd like to open the floor for any questions. So while people get their questions in, please feel free to talk about that. And actually, Tiara just corrected me, we're 91 days now from the election.
I can answer part of this question, maybe. As a STEM student, I think that during this crisis, particularly, we have seen how much the policies affect us directly. We are asked, and I'm not talking about chemists only, I'm talking about all sorts of research and biology and medicine, chemistry, etc. People are asked to work and work harder when in miserable working conditions. And I'm not saying miserable, it's not the worst working conditions, but it is bad. It is bad than working conditions of those who have facilitated the problem, or those who are choosing or writing the laws. We have seen tragedies in terms of PPE across the field. The safety of the workplace. All these are really important issues that should be addressed. So STEM people should be political about these things. They should voice their concerns. They cannot stay out of it and let others decide. That is the main thing that I have to say. I don't know if Shom has something else to add.
Yeah, definitely agree. I think the thing maybe I would add is, I think there's a lot of attention to national politics, national economic policy, or, because it's visible, the media covers it, it's at some degree entertaining almost to even, follow. But the reality is, in national politics and where we are today, you know, the median senator, so the most powerful, like a lot of people like to say, you know, the most powerful person in the country right now is Joe Manchin, a senator from West Virginia, who's a conservative Democrat. So if you're thinking about at the national level, who's really the veto player, it's Joe Manchin. And you think about, is the policy that we're advocating for gonna get Joe Manchin to say yes? And I think in a lot of these things, the answer, you know, at this point in time, is no. And so that's not to say like, don't stop focusing on national policy. You should definitely be voting in national elections and, you know, advocating for issues that matter, like, you know, Green New Deal, reviving the labor movement, addressing, you know, issues of economic inequality. But I think, you know, if we put all our hopes into the national politics basket, we're going to be disappointed for a long time until we've really built up that movement again. And that's going to take a long time. So I would encourage people to really think about, you know, what can you do in local politics or even state politics? So, you know, rates of voter turnout in those in local and state elections are abysmal. They're like 20% of voters, and it's even worse, you know, the younger you go. And so it's bad, but because it's so bad, if you do vote in these elections and stay informed, you actually wield a lot of power. And especially if you get organized, if you get connected to local political groups and organizers, that's in a lot of ways, it's a place where you can wield power and see the fruits of your labor very quickly, actually. And if you think about a lot of the changes that are happening today in the defund the police movement, it's all local politics at this point. And you see a lot of changes happening as a result of local political action. So that's kind of the main takeaway that I would have is, you know, keep focusing on national politics, but also invest in local and state politics.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And actually, in terms of politics, so I have another question from the audience. This one coming from Shom Mazumder, who first off would like you both to know that you're doing a wonderful job. And second, what's the best response you have to political actors who treat the COVID situation like a choice between survival and the economy? And can you really have a successful economy in which workers are dying off? Elsy, if you'd like to start?
Yeah, I can start. You cannot have an economy if you don't have workers. The priority should be the health and the safety of the workers. They are the majority. They are the ones that are creating the economy. So I understand the concerns, but if you look at this crisis lately, the stock market is fine. The billionaires are getting richer, but the people are losing their jobs. They are sick. They are concerned. They are worried. They are stressed. They are those that suffer the most. So this should be their priority. This is my opinion, and this is what I have to say.
Yeah, I would say, you know, it's definitely also agree, you know, it's framed as a trade-off between, you know, save the economy or, you know, save people's lives. But again, I guess I would point to you like, is that economy worth saving? Was the economy that we had before all of this really worth saving? I think that's a big question we should be asking ourselves, is the way things were going, given all the, you know, the facts and trends that we started with, that I talked about, was that worth it? And I think the answer to me, and I think if you think about, you know, again, people getting laid off their jobs, losing their healthcare, people, you know, children losing a year's schooling potentially, which we know has huge long-term impacts on a lot of different outcomes. That economy clearly wasn't working before. And so I think what I would think about it like, how can we re-envision an economy that's resilient afterward? Because clearly the one that we had before wasn't. It couldn't survive a pandemic. Even though there's coronavirus was not just in the US, it's globally, but there are some countries that are able to, handle it better than ours. And so I think for me, it's obviously, the answer is yes, we should save the economy and we should save people. We should think hard about what economy we want to save coming out of this.
Thanks, and I actually have one last question for you both. This is coming from one of our attendees. So how can we most effectively advocate for more equitable economic policies? Are there specific policies we should be paying closer attention to besides the Green New Deal? We've seen a lot of calls to tax the most wealthy in the US, but how much impact can tax policy actually have on addressing any inequities?
Sure, okay. I'll jump in. So I think there's one thing, there are a couple things I think. So 2 facts that are out there and then 1 solution that hopefully addresses some of those facts. So the first fact is, in general, people vastly underestimate the amount of inequality that there is in the United States. And once that's corrected, they become much more supportive of redistribution. And I think we've made a long way toward, correcting misperceptions about inequality, but I think, Americans writ large don't actually even agree on, basic facts. So that's kind of point number 1. Point number 2 is, despite that, when you ask people about, do they support, progressive taxation or increasing, marginal tax rates on the wealthy, most people support that. So the idea is that, 1, we underestimate actual inequality, but even given those underestimations, people already support this. And once those beliefs are, adjusted, they would probably support it even more. So the real question is, given people support this, and once, the basic facts about wealth inequality are put out there, and people become even more supportive of it, why don't we have it now? And I think why don't we have policy now? And I think a big issue is that, the ways in which those policies we advocate for those policies, it's not really just the voting booth at the end of the day. It's the voting booth and holding politicians accountable so that when they promise, to increase the marginal tax rates on the wealthy, that we hold them to that and that their electoral prospects depend on it. And that requires movement making. So I wouldn't say, the voting part, you should vote if that's, what you believe in, and I hope you do, but also getting involved in, movement building is required for accountability in that sense. So that's just to say, people agree we should tax the wealthy, but really the core thing that's missing is, a mass movement.
Rossi, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I don't have much to add to this, but I would say that we should look into the policies that support the well-being of all, and taxing the rich, that is something that I would say it's trivial, because if you tax like 1%, 2%, 2% tax on the millionaires, imagine what you can do with, or on the billionaires, I mean, imagine what you can do with this amount of money. And you can eradicate homelessness in some cases. There are studies that show like the effect of taxing the rich, and that will not make them poor, that will not make them less rich or stop being a billionaire or whatever. Another thing is, it is important to revive the unions, because you can only imagine if politicians were turning to unions for their approval instead of instead of big corporations and billionaires. In the end of the day, the unions should have millions of people enrolled, and these people are all voters. They should be making the decisions and definitely holding the politicians accountable. This reminds me of a story that happened in France over 30 years ago when the president got elected. I think it was François Mitterrand. There was a popular movement, and people were asking for better, like to better their working conditions and better life, etc. And after he got elected, people did not leave the street, and they told him, "We're staying there until you make sure that whatever you promised is accomplished." So I think that something of this sort need to happen here.
Well, thank you so much, both of you, for being here. And just to close things off, I'd like to pass things back over to Tiara. You're still muted.
Thanks, Shom and Elsy, for teaching us. I definitely learned a lot, especially on, just like the power of like people organizing together, and also the impact that we can have if we're also paying attention, not just to the national level stuff, but also the local level stuff. And thanks, Jairo, for moderating. Please stay tuned for next week. We're having a panel on the climate crisis, so it ties in really well with the Green New Deal discussion that we just had. And after that, we have a couple more. But yeah, until next week.